All right, welcome to Methods for Studying Culture and Psychology, where we will take a critical race view of the methods we use to study culture and psychology. Using Chapter 42, we'll look at narrative, storytelling, and the mantra of intersectionality. The big concept is that critical race theory uses cultural resources to dismantle racism and classism. Intersectionality is, of course, the intersection of things. So, bless me. This author says you can't talk about race without talking about class. Can't talk about class without talking about race. They are intersected. They are intertwined. And a cultural resource is knowledge based on experience or experiential knowledge. Another example of a cultural resource would be a folk tale, maybe even a consejo, a kitchen talk, an autobiographical story. These variations of stories are ways that we can dismantle racism, dismantle classism. Let's go deeper. This narrative and storytelling method seeks to critique essentialist narratives in law, education, and the social sciences. So we have a dominant narrative about law in this country, which is that the crime should fit, or the punishment should fit the crime. We might even say that the dominant narrative is that all people who commit the same crime get the same punishment, right? That seems fair. However, you may go, but that's not what happens, is it, Dr. Griffin? A black man who's caught for possession does not always get the same amount of time as a white man who is caught for possession of drugs. So we have this dominant narrative that says everyone is treated equally in this country, founded on, what does it say in our Constitution? Everyone gets to have life, liberty, and the pursuit of freedom. But if you were to interview the people who don't receive fair treatment, they would have a different story to tell. They'd have a different story to tell about laws in this country, a different story to tell about education and access to schooling in this country, and certainly they'd have a different story to tell about social sciences, how we relate to each other, psychology, sociology. So what's the dominant narrative? What's the dominant story in this country? It's a story of Western modernism. And it's this Western modernism that's described as a network or grid of broad assumptions and beliefs that are deeply embedded in the way dominant Western culture constructs the nature of the world and one's experiences in it. So maybe something like the American dream. That is a dominant Western construct that says everyone who works hard will have success. And if we take a racial viewpoint, we would say, yeah, everyone who works hard can have success as long as they're not this race, or as long as they're not this gender, as long as they don't have these disabilities. So it's this Western modernism set of assumptions that drives the dominant tale, the dominant story, the dominant voice in this country. And I have this highlighted because these assumptions are so deeply embedded that sometimes people don't even know that that's what they're believing. And that's some psychology for you. When we practice counter storytelling, we make the voice of the voiceless heard in the public arena. Counter storytelling can include myths, folk tales, dichos, consejos, kitchen talk, and autobiographical stories. The author of this and people who use critical race theory say that these are valuable sources of knowledge. Just because a myth isn't published in an academic textbook Doesn't mean that it's not a valuable cultural resource. Doesn't mean it's not influencing the culture. I'm sure that something your grandparent told you once about a myth or a folktale is still sticking with you today. Or maybe you had a teacher when you were a child tell you a folktale in school, and like you really remember that. That's not in a textbook, but it helps shape who you are, and it helps shape your beliefs. Unquestionably, now we're talking about now we're talking about the intersection of things, intersectionality. Unquestionably, don't even question it, racism is intersected with economics. Can't talk about race without talking about money. Can't talk about money without talking about race. Not in this country, not in this lifetime. Racism is integral to the process of capital accumulation. And to pretend otherwise is to not get to the heart of the issue, not to get to any long-lasting solutions. Okay, you may have been confused by this very brief reading in the chapter, and I want to say that that's okay, because the author of this chapter assumes that you, the reader, knows what critical race theory is, and they kind of spend their time getting into how critical race theory researchers can have shortcomings in their research methods when they don't consider the intersection of politics and economics, the politics of race, the economics of race. So the point of this author is to say there might be some methodological, some research method issues in the way that we're conducting research on racism. And that relates, of course, to our previous lecture on methods for cultural psychology research. So I'm going to give you a brief tutorial of the 5 tenets of critical race theory, and we're going to land on counter storytelling. So the first tenet is that racism is permanent. Racism is seen as an inherent part of the American civilization to people who use critical race theory. And racism is defined as an organizing framework that favors being white or acting as white. So addressing racism head on, not pretending like it doesn't exist. Second tenet, whiteness as property. This means that this means that researchers understand that the only group who can possess things like land, things like the right to enjoy, the right to exclude, this only belongs to people who are white. Let's see. Interest convergence means that white people are the primary people who benefit from this system. The myth of colorblindness says that colorblindness is a mechanism that allows people to simply ignore racist policies that perpetuate social inequity. Let's see. And then, so the myth of colorblindness would say everyone who gets arrested and complies with the arresting officer gets to get taken to jail safely. Critical race theory would say, well, actually, there's a lot of elements of racism and power struggles, and that can be used to explain why George Floyd was arrested but was not taken to jail safely, because colorblindness isn't a thing and we need to stop acting like it. Counter storytelling is where we land. Counter storytelling means bringing back the stories of marginalized communities. Not bringing the stories of someone who's different than you, but bringing back the stories of a marginalized community, a community that has been excluded from certain rights, from privileges. Are you starting to think of groups of people in your head? So what is critical race theory? Well, there was, of course, a whole book written on the key writings that formed the movement. I am not assigning you that book. I will give you a brief overview of the topics that critical race theory can cover. We can use this relationship between race, racism, and power to examine economics in our country, history, context, feelings, group interest and self-interest, as well as things that happen in the unconscious realm, because that's all psychology. I really want to bring back my favorite educational philosopher, Paulo Freire, who came up with this word that didn't exist to describe if transformation is going to happen, then there needs to be equal parts reflection and equal parts action. So CRT is cool because it also involves activism, that action element of praxis. That goes beyond understanding the social situation. So now that we have reflection, let's have some action. And it's that combination that transforms the racial hierarchies. And we have some racial hierarchies and some power privileges in this country that need to be transformed. I like CRT because it challenges dominant ideologies. It takes the what is normal in this country and says, is that normal? Or is it what's accepted by what white people have identified as acceptable? And is there a way to challenge what the people in charge, or usually what the white, wealthy, WEIRD, what the weird culture says? Like, can we challenge that? Is there any room for our voice? Can other voices be heard in the room? Dang. Or is there only one right way of doing things? I like challenging dominant ideologies. Yes, I do. All within respect, of course. And with all theories, there comes critiques. And the major critique of CRT that I want to be sure you know, because nothing's perfect, as many people say, oh, well, critical race theory, all they are is critics. All they do is talk about the problems. They never talk about solutions. So that is a critique. I would say, in response to that, not that you asked me, but I would say, well, you got to name it to tame it. We got to name the problem in order to transform it. So maybe there is something beyond that we need to add onto this critical race theory. But it certainly starts with identifying the problem, because it can't solve what can't be identified. These counter-storytelling, counter-narratives is a way to challenge the bulk of psychological research that gets characterized by cultural weirdos. What to think about next? How can you be part of the solution? You can question cross-cultural comparisons when you read about them in studies. Like, the social media posts that reference studies, or on the news it says, research shows, like, does it show? These questions look like, are the researchers using culture level measures? These questions also look like, what cultural resources do I use in my decision making? Did that folklore that my abuelo told me about, is that driving my decision making today? And how can I participate in documenting counter narratives? How can I make way for allowing the voiceless to be heard? One hint is that as you complete our activity for this learning module, where you interview someone from a different culture, you could choose to document a counter narrative by interviewing someone from a different culture who's also part of a marginalized culture, part of a culture that has been excluded from privileges or rights in this country. You don't have to, but you could if you'd like. The choice is yours as ever, and I will see you in cultural products.